On the fog-laden banks of the River Avon in Bath, a centuries-old tragedy refuses to rest. Elizabeth Harrow, a bride betrayed and drowned on her wedding night in 1872, haunts the river with a chilling vow. Any man who dares approach shall become her eternal groom beneath the water. When Thomas Reid, a curious journalist, arrives to investigate the legend, he discovers that some stories are more than mere folklore. Drawn into a web of sorrow, vengeance, and the supernatural, Thomas and local historian Claire Donovan must confront a bride whose curse has lasted over 100 years and who will never forgive. The River Avon was shrouded in a dense, ghostly fog that rolled in from the moors like a living thing. The moon was little more than a pale smudge above the clouds, its light broken and distorted in the black water below. The current slapped rhythmically against the stone embankments, a sound not unlike hushed voices, whispering secrets no man should ever hear. Thomas Reid stood by the railing of Pulteney Bridge, clutching his notebook, the chill of the night cutting through his coat. He was a man who had chased ghost stories across Europe, always skeptical yet always fascinated. Folklore, superstition, whispered tales of curses, they had filled his articles, brought him small notoriety, and kept him searching for the next legend. The River Avon, however, felt different. The weight in the air pressed down on him as though the river itself were aware of his presence. Earlier that evening, he had sat in the corner of a smoky tavern, listening to the locals. Their voices had lowered when the subject of the river came up. One old man, his hands trembling as he held his pint, muttered, "Best keep your eyes shut at night when you walk past the Avon. She don't like to be looked at." Another leaned closer, his tone half warning, half confession. "There's something under that water. Don't ever call her name. Don't even think it." Thomas had smiled politely, scribbling notes in his pad. He had heard such warnings before in other towns and villages. But there had been something in their eyes, not the mischievous gleam of men telling tall tales, but the fear of people who truly believed what they were saying now. Standing at the water's edge, he felt that same unease crawling under his skin. The fog clung to him, damp and icy, muffling the world until the only sound left was the water's endless whispering. He shook off the chill, crossed the bridge, and found his lodging, a crooked old inn tucked against the riverbank, its stone walls glistening with moss. The innkeeper, a gaunt woman with sharp features, handed him his key without much ceremony. When Thomas asked about the legend of the drowned bride, her lips tightened and she only said, "Best not ask questions you don't want answers to." His room overlooked the river. The window panes were old, warped slightly with age, and rattled faintly whenever the current struck the embankments below. Thomas unpacked his bag, set his recorder on the nightstand, and sat by the desk to write down his first impressions of Bath, of the bridge, and of the strange tension that hung in the air like the mist itself. It was past midnight when the first sound reached him. At first, he thought it was the wind, a low, wavering sigh carried across the river. But as he sat still, holding his breath, he heard it again. A voice, a woman's voice, faint but piercing, carrying through the glass. It was not singing, not speaking, was crying. The sound seeped into the room, thin and desperate, as though the window itself were weeping. Thomas rose from the bed and pressed his ear to the glass. The sobs grew sharper, cutting into him like cold steel. He could almost make out words, but they dissolved in the mist, drowned by the pulse of the river. He stepped back, his pulse quickening, The room felt colder now. The damp had thickened, crawling across the floorboards, settling into his lungs. The crying continued, relentless. It came from the water, from the darkness beneath the bridge, rising to his window as if someone was standing just outside, calling to be let in. Thomas gripped his recorder, pressed the red button, and whispered into it, "First night. Strange. Sounds by the river. It sounds like a woman crying. It's clearer than I expected. Almost too clear." The sobbing did not stop until dawn. When the first weak light of morning broke through the fog, the river looked calm, silent, and empty. But Thomas knew what he had heard, and the River Avon, dark and impenetrable, seemed to whisper back, "You should not have listened." The next morning, Thomas walked through the narrow streets of Bath with the uneasy weight of the night still pressing. On his chest, the city was beautiful in the daylight, with its honey-colored Georgian buildings glowing under a pale sun. But the river ran through it like a scar. Even now, with people bustling along the bridge and carriages rattling over the cobblestones, Thomas could not forget the sound of the woman's sobbing that had followed him through the hours of darkness. He had arranged to meet Claire Donovan at a small cafe near the Abbey. She was a local historian, a doctoral candidate who had written a thesis on Bath's forgotten tragedies. More importantly, she was one of the few willing to speak openly about the legend that the townspeople seemed desperate to bury. Claire arrived with a stack of books under her arm, her hair pulled back, her eyes bright with a mix of curiosity and wariness. "You stayed near the river?" she asked, settling into the chair across from him. "Yes," Thomas replied. "The inn by Pulteney Bridge. I thought it would give me the best view for my research." Her face paled slightly. "That place. People who spend the night there often hear things they shouldn't. You heard it too, didn't you?" Thomas hesitated, then nodded. A woman's voice. Crying, Claire let out a slow breath, as if she had been expecting the answer. She opened one of her books, its pages yellowed with age, and turned it so he could see. "This is the story you've come for," she said, "but I need you to understand, isn't just folklore. People here live with it. They avoid the river after dark. They don't say her name, because every time someone gets too close, she notices." Thomas leaned forward. "Tell me." Claire's voice lowered, though the cafe was half empty. Her name was Elizabeth Harrow. She was to be married in 1872, on a night when the river swelled with rain. The wedding never ended in celebration. The bride disappeared. Some said she slipped on the bridge. Others whispered that she was pushed. But no body was ever recovered in one piece. Only fragments. Thomas frowned. Fragments. Claire's hand trembled slightly as she traced a brittle page. A piece of her wedding dress. Torn, blood-stained, tangled with riverweed. It surfaced days later near the banks. They buried what they found. But no grave holds her. The noise of the cafe seemed to fade, leaving only the hollow sound of her words. From that night on, Claire continued, people who cross Pulteney Bridge at midnight hear her. Some see her. They say she stands at the center of the bridge, in her gown, her face hidden by her hair, and she calls, not loudly, not screaming, just soft enough that you lean closer to hear. And that's when she pulls you in. Thomas felt his skin prickle, and the words she speaks. Claire's lips pressed together. She did not want to say them, but finally, in a whisper, she gave him the phrase the villagers feared. "Come with me." Thomas repeated the words, under his breath, tasting their weight. Claire shook her head sharply. "Don't say it. Never repeat her call. That's how she binds you." It isn't just a story, Mr. Reed. Men have vanished from this town. They leave no trace, no footprints, no cries for help. Only the sound of the river swallowing. Outside, the bells of Bath Abbey began to toll. Claire closed the book, her fingers pale against the cover. She doesn't want to be forgotten, she said, and she never forgives. Thomas sat back, his mind caught between skepticism and dread. He had hunted legends for years, but none had ever felt this close, this raw, this dangerous dot. Yet as he looked at the river glinting through the window, he knew one thing for certain: he could not turn away now. The mist returned with nightfall, rolling over Bath in slow, heavy waves. Thomas stood at the edge of the River Avon, his notebook forgotten in his pocket, his camera hanging from his neck. The streets were nearly empty. Even the pubs had fallen, quieter than usual, as though the whole town knew to withdraw when the fog thickened. He told himself he was there for research, for evidence, but his heart raced with something closer to dread. The story Claire had told him echoed in his head. She doesn't forgive. She doesn't forget. The river lapped against the stone banks, rhythmic and insistent. The surface shone with a dull silver sheen beneath the broken light of the moon. Then it came, the sound. At first so faint he thought it was his imagination, a woman's sob drifting along the water. The same sound he had heard through the window the night before, but sharper now, closer. The cry bent and twisted with the wind, drawing him forward across the cobblestones until he found himself standing in the center of Pulteney Bridge. The world felt unnaturally still, and then he saw her. A pale figure stood at the far end of the bridge, white gown heavy with dampness, fabric dragging across the stone. Her hair hung in long blackened strands, clinging to her shoulders, covering her face. She did not move. She did not breathe. She only stood in the mist, as though she had risen from the water itself. Thomas raised his camera with trembling hands. The lens focused. The shutter clicked, a sound like splitting glass rang out. The screen fractured, a jagged crack tearing across it. The camera wind, the image distorted. Then, just before the display went black, a face filled the viewfinder. Bluish skin, swollen lips, eyes rolled back. The face pressed against the lens as if the dead were trying to climb through. Thomas stumbled backward, the camera slipping from his grip, clattering to the stones. He snatched it up, but the screen was gone. Nothing but black and broken lines. His pulse thundered in his ears. He turned to run, but the bridge stretched before him like a tunnel of fog, endless and suffocating. The sobbing rose higher now, surrounding him from every side. Back at the inn, shaking and drenched in cold sweat, Thomas sat at the desk and pressed play on his recorder. The tape hissed. Then a drip, 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 like water falling from a great height, and then came the voice, not sobbing now, but whispering low, deliberate, heavy with possession. "You are mine." The words poured into his ears, each syllable cold as the river itself. Thomas dropped the recorder, heart hammering, but the voice went on, echoing even after the tape clicked off, as though the river had already seeped into him. The morning light offered no comfort. Bathurst's golden stone facades seemed less radiant, dulled beneath a heavy sky. Thomas hadn't slept. The recorder still sat on the desk where he'd dropped it, silent and accusing. Even in the bright of day, he swore he could feel the words vibrating in his bones. "You are mine." Claire noticed his exhaustion the moment she met him outside Bath Abbey. "You look like you've seen her," she said quietly. Thomas tried to laugh it off, but the sound was hollow. "Maybe I did. She studied him, then gave a small nod as though she had expected that answer. "Come with me, there's something you need to see." They walked together through narrow streets until the abbey bells faded behind them. At the edge of the old quarter, Claire pushed open a heavy wooden door and led him into a dim church library that smelled of dust and candle wax. Rows of shelves leaned with age, their books swollen and cracked from damp. "This is where the records are kept," she explained. "Baptisms, burials, marriages, deaths, and the other things no one talks about." At the far end of the room, a frail figure was waiting. The church archivist, an old man with paper-thin skin and sharp, restless eyes. His hands trembled as he unlocked a cabinet and drew out a thick, leather-bound ledger. Claire opened the book carefully on the table. The pages whispered as she turned them, each one filled with spidery handwriting. Finally, she stopped. "Here," she said. Thomas leaned over her shoulder. The entry was brief. Elizabeth Harrow, taken, 1872. Nothing more, just 2 words to describe. A vanished bride. But beneath the neat black script, in a different hand, another message had been scrawled in red ink. The letters seemed to pulse on the page, their edges blurred as if the ink had bled into the parchment. "Her soul is bound to the river. Do not answer when she calls." Thomas felt his mouth go dry. "Who wrote this?" The archivist's voice rasped. "Like dry leaves. Not one of us. Not any priest. The hand is older. Some say it appeared in the book by itself." Claire shut the ledger, but the words seemed burned into Thomas's mind. The archivist moved closer, his eyes clouded yet intense. "Many have gone looking for her. Scholars, skeptics, men like you, all thought they could solve the riddle. All thought they could shine light into the darkness. But she doesn't want light. She wants company." Thomas forced himself to ask, "And what happened to them?" The old man's face sank into shadow. "They went missing, one by one. The river takes what it is owed. Their names are never written here, because no bodies were ever found." The silence stretched, broken only by the groan of the building's timbers. Thomas backed away from the table. He had wanted truth, a story, something to fill the pages of his next article. But what he had found was no longer legend, a warning written in blood, as they stepped back into the grey light of the street. Claire's expression was grim. "She called you, didn't she?" she asked. Thomas didn't answer, but the ache in his chest, the memory of that voice, told her everything she needed to know. Rain threatened in the sky that evening, low clouds pressing against the rooftops of Bath. Thomas and Claire sat in a quiet corner of the inn, both too unsettled to touch their drinks. The ledger's crimson warning still lingered in their minds. The door creaked open, and a tall man in a dark coat entered. His presence drew immediate attention. Stern jawline, greying hair, and the heavy step of someone used to command. He scanned the room until his gaze found Thomas. "Mr. Reed," he said, voice low, heavy with authority. A word, Claire's. Expression tightened. "Inspector Harrow," she whispered. They followed him into a back room lit by a single oil lamp. The inspector shut the door and stood with his back to it, as if to block their escape. His eyes were hard, but beneath the steel lay exhaustion and guilt. "You've already seen her, haven't you?" Harrow asked. Thomas hesitated, but Claire spoke for him. "Yes, and she's marked him." The inspector swore under his breath and dragged a chair closer. He sat heavily, rubbing his temples. "Then there's no point in silence anymore. You deserve the truth, though it won't save you. He looked at Thomas with eyes burdened by generations of shame. "Elizabeth Harrow was my blood," he said. "My ancestor. The story you've heard is only half of it. She wasn't just a bride who drowned. She was betrayed." The room seemed to contract around his words. Her groom Arthur, Harunava, wanted her. The marriage was forced, arranged to strengthen the family's wealth. On the night of the wedding, after the vows were spoken, Arthur confessed his love for another woman. Elizabeth begged him to honor their union, to stay, but he dragged her to the river. Some say she fought, others say she prayed, but Arthur, his voice faltered. Arthur pushed her, held her under until the river claimed her. Claire covered her mouth, horrified. Harrow's voice grew heavier. He thought he could be rid of her, bury the scandal, and marry again. But death didn't silence Elizabeth. Her body was broken, but her spirit, it rose. The river became her veil, her tomb, her altar. She vowed she would never forgive thee. Harrow line. And every 7 years, she takes one man, drowns him, makes him her husband beneath the water. A groom for eternity. Thomas's chest tightened. "And you think, she's chosen me?" The inspector's eyes didn't waver. "The crying, the voice on your recorder, the marks she leaves. Yes, you're already hers. The curse is awake. Again, and you were foolish enough to answer her call." The oil lamp flickered. For a moment, shadows moved across the wall like long fingers stretching out to claim them. Claire whispered, "Is there no way to stop her, to break the cycle?" Harrow shook his head slowly. "We've tried. Priests, rituals, fire, but you cannot break a vow made in blood and betrayal. She doesn't want release. She wants vengeance. She wants a groom." Thomas felt the air thicken, as if the river's damp breath had followed them inside. Somewhere beyond the inn's walls, thunder rolled. The storm was coming, and with it, the bride. The storm broke the following night. Rain battered the windows of the inn, each drop striking the glass like fingernails. Wind howled through the streets of Bath, rattling shutters and sending the smell of the river wafting inland. Inside the inn's parlor, a circle of candles flickered on a warped wooden table. Their flames bent and sputtered as though they, too, feared what was to come. Thomas sat across from Claire, his recorder ready, his camera useless since the night on the bridge. Beside them, Inspector Harrow lingered near the door, arms crossed, unwilling but unable to stay away. At the head of the table sat a medium. The innkeeper had summoned a thin woman dressed in black, her eyes sunken, her fingers adorned with tarnished rings. She called herself Madame Vera. "If you wish to speak with her," Vera murmured, "you must accept the risk. The river bride does not come for conversation. She comes for claim." Thomas glanced at Claire. Her face was pale, but her jaw was set. "We have no choice," she said. The candles dimmed as the séance began. Vera's hands hovered over the table, trembling as though seized by some unseen current. The air thickened with damp, the smell of algae and silt creeping into the room. "Elizabeth Harrow," Vera intoned. "Bride of the river, do you hear us? Do you see us?" The glass on the table shivered. Somewhere in the inn, a mirror cracked with a sharp report. Harrow stiffened, his face blanching. Then came the voice. It did not come from the medium's mouth. It seeped from the walls, from the water-soaked timbers of the inn, from the floor beneath their feet. A woman's sob, broken, grieving. Then, words, heavy with anguish. "Why did you leave me at the altar?" The candles guttered. The parlor seemed to tilt. shadows bending unnaturally. Vera's head snapped back, her mouth open in a silent scream as something pressed through her, using her as a channel. Why? The voice cried again, this time so close that Thomas felt breath on his cheek. Claire gasped, clutching her throat. Her dress tightened against her body, though no hand touched it. The fabric bunched and twisted as if grasped by unseen fingers, pulling her down, pinning her to the floor. Claire. Thomas lunged forward, trying to pry her free, but the force only tightened. Her face turned red, her limbs thrashing as though she were drowning in invisible water. The inspector roared and tried to tear her away, but the cold spread to him as well. His hands recoiled as though burned by ice. Across the table, the medium's voice erupted, layered with another, deeper tone. You left me to die. You will not leave again. None of you will. Suddenly, one of the candles burst, hot wax spraying the table. The glass in the center of the circle shattered, and the oppressive force vanished as quickly as it had come. Claire gasped for air, collapsing against Thomas, her skin clammy and cold as riverstone. The medium slumped forward, unconscious, her breath shallow. Inspector Harrow stood rigid, his face grey. She's stronger this time, he said. She's already dragging you under, even while you breathe. Thomas looked down at Claire, at the damp stains spreading across her dress as though she had been pulled from the river itself. He knew then that the seance had not summoned Elizabeth. It had only opened the door wider. The storm raged without mercy. Rain slashed across the streets of Bath, turning cobblestones into slick rivers. Thunder rolled through the sky like the pounding of a colossal drum, and the River Avon swelled with violent hunger, frothing against its banks as though desperate to break free. Thomas clutched his camera, though it was cracked and half broken, and ran toward the bridge. Claire shouted after him, but her voice was swallowed by the wind. Something compelled him forward, whether the journalist's need for proof or the curse's invisible tether. He no longer knew. All he felt was the pull of the river. When he reached the water's edge, the fog parted in a slow, deliberate sweep, revealing the figure waiting for him. Elizabeth Harrow emerged from the heart of the storm. She rose from the black water as though gravity had no claim on her, her gown sodden and heavy, trailing behind in tatters streaked with silt and riverweed. Her eyes glowed a lifeless white, fixed on Thomas with an intensity that froze his breath. Her skin shimmered with a pale blue sheen, mottled and bruised like something long drowned. She stepped onto the stone embankment, each footfall leaving behind a wet stain that spread unnaturally wide, as though the river itself seeped up to meet her. Her lips parted, and the cry that had haunted Thomas for nights tore through the storm. Come with me. The voice cut into him like a blade. His body shuddered. His legs moved without his will, dragging him closer to the edge. No. Claire's voice rang out, shrill and desperate. She appeared from the mist, clutching Thomas's arm with both hands, anchoring him. But Elizabeth's hand shot forward, pale and water-slick, and seized his wrist. The touch was ice. The chill burned through his veins, spreading from his arm to his chest, freezing his heart in its grip. Thomas screamed as the world tipped and the river swallowed him whole. The Avon closed over his head, heavy and suffocating. In the depths below, pale faces stared back at him. Dozens of men, their eyes opened wide, mouths frozen in eternal silence. Their bodies drifted around him, caught in the current, hands reaching as though to drag him deeper. He saw wedding bands still clinging to swollen fingers, tattered clothes, scraps of white fabric entwined with bones, the drowned husbands of Elizabeth Harrow. And then she was there, inches from him, her hair fanning out in the water like a black veil, her face pressed close to his, lips curved into a smile too cold to be human. Her voice carried through the depths without sound, a whisper inside his mind. You are mine. His lungs burned, his body convulsed, fighting for air. But the current bound him, pulling him deeper into her kingdom. A sudden force wrenched him upward. Claire's arms locked around his chest, dragging him, kicking, clawing toward the surface. The river fought to keep him, Elizabeth's grip tearing across his arm, her nails raking his skin until blood clouded the water. With a violent gasp, Thomas broke the surface. He coughed and choked, rain and river water pouring from his mouth. Claire dragged him to the embankment, collapsing with him in the mud. But when Thomas looked down at his arm, he saw the truth of what had nearly claimed him. Deep, purple bruises marked his skin in the shape of a woman's fingers. The imprint of her nails carved into his flesh, dark and unyielding, as though she had branded him. The storm thundered overhead, but Thomas heard only her voice echoing inside him, relentless and final. You are mine. The days after the storm were heavy with silence. Bath seemed to have returned to its normal rhythm, but Thomas and Claire knew the truth: the curse had not ended. The river's surface was deceptively calm, yet beneath it, Elizabeth Harrow waited, patient, eternal, and merciless. Thomas's arm throbbed, the purple bruises from her grip refusing to fade. At night, he awoke, drenched in sweat, gasping as though drowning all over again. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her pale face, her white eyes staring into his soul, lips twisted into that frozen, chilling smile. We have to end it, he said one evening, staring at the cracked camera that had once captured her. There has to be a way to break the curse. There has to be a ritual, a prayer, something. Claire shook her head, her voice hollow. We've tried everything. We can find the church records, the ledgers, the old manuscripts. There is no exorcism strong enough. Her will is bound to the river itself. She doesn't want release. She never did. Thomas felt a chill crawl along his spine. Then what does she want? Claire's eyes met his, wide with fear. Vengeance. She promised herself she would never forgive the Harrow line, and she will never forgive anyone who dares to approach her river. She's marking anyone who comes near as her next groom. That night, Thomas tried to sleep, but the haunting began anew. He heard it first as a whisper, just beneath the level of consciousness, like water slipping through the cracks of the inn. Come with me. Then came the visions. He would catch glimpses of Claire in mirrors, her reflection wearing a wet, blood-stained wedding gown. He would awaken to find himself wearing the same garment, soaked and heavy, as though the river itself had claimed him in sleep. Claire, too, began to change. She would stiffen suddenly, eyes rolling upward, lips moving in silent repetition of that same phrase, "You are mine." She would awake hours later, trembling, with no memory of her own actions. And Thomas could only hold her as the chill receded in desperation. They returned to the Abbey, searching once more through the historical archives. There, buried beneath centuries of dust, they found the personal journal of Elizabeth Harrow. Her words were meticulous, written in trembling ink. I will never forgive the Harrow line. I will never leave the river, and any man who dares approach me will join me in the depths. I do not pray for release. I pray that the curse endures and that those who think themselves brave enough to seek me learn what it means to belong to the river. Thomas closed the journal, the paper damp and trembling in his hands. "It's hopeless," he whispered. Claire nodded, tears streaking her face. "We can't stop her. We can only survive her attention, for now." Outside, the river moaned like a living thing. Thomas swore he heard laughter hidden in its rushing waters, the soft, eerie giggle of Elizabeth Harrow. The curse was not an accident, not a fleeting vengeance, it was eternal. And in that moment, both Thomas and Claire understood a terrifying truth. The river did not want them to leave. It wanted them marked. It wanted them to belong to Elizabeth Harrow. The night fell heavy over Bath. The fog rolled in thick from the river, swallowing street lamps and muting the city's usual glow. Even the river itself seemed different, darker, hungrier, as if anticipating something. Thomas had resolved to leave. Every nerve in his body screamed that Bath held no safety for him, that the curse had claimed too much already. Claire helped him pack in silence, her hands trembling as she folded his coat. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice tight, "be careful. Don't answer her if she calls." He nodded, though he knew it might already be too late. By the time they reached the inn's door, the wind had picked up, carrying the scent of wet earth and river silt. Somewhere in the distance, water slapped against stone as if in applause. They hadn't gone far when Thomas froze. A figure moved in the fog, possibly white, impossibly still. The bride, Elizabeth Harrow, emerged from the mist, her gown soaked and trailing behind her in dirty rags. Her eyes, hollow and white, locked on him. She raised a hand, skeletal and dripping, pointing directly at Thomas. "Thomas," whispered the wind. The voice was unmistakable, though the fog distorted it. "Come with me." Thomas felt his legs betray him, moving forward even as his mind screamed to stop. Claire grabbed him, but her hands passed through his shoulders as if they were not solid. The world tilted, and he could feel the river reaching up, pulling him toward its waiting depths. From the mist, Inspector Harrow appeared. He shouted, "Do not go near her." But even his voice was swallowed by the roar of the river. Thomas tried to resist, but the bride's hand found him, icy and relentless. His vision swam as he felt himself drawn forward over cobblestones and into the water's edge. The Avon surged up around him, and he realized he was moving without choice, as if the river itself carried him. Claire screamed, chasing him, but the ground shifted beneath her feet. He saw her eyes, wide and terrified, reaching for him. He opened his mouth to call back, but no sound escaped. Behind him, Elizabeth's smile widened, cruel and final. Harrow's warning went unheeded. Thomas stepped into the water, and it closed over his head. Darkness enveloped him, and he felt the cold hands of the river tugging at his limbs. Somewhere above, Claire's voice was a faint echo, screaming his name. Hours later, the fog lifted slightly, revealing a silent riverbank. No footprints led away from the water. The only sign that Thomas had been there was the faint swirl in the river, like the remnants of something dragged beneath the surface. All that remained on the embankment was a single wet footprint, and in the distance, the faint glimmer of a white gown disappearing into the depths. No one in Bath saw Thomas Reed again, and when people passed the river that night, all they could hear was the soft, eternal whisper carried by the current. "You are mine." Weeks passed, but Bath felt emptier than ever. The fog still clung to the river at night, heavier than before, as if the city itself held its breath. Locals whispered of Thomas Reed, the journalist who had vanished from Pulteney Bridge. News outlets ran brief reports, calling it a mysterious disappearance, but no one found a body, no one found a trace. Then the camera was discovered. It had washed up along the embankment, wedged between stones, cracked and warped by the river. Its screen flickered with static, and when technicians managed to power it on, the images it held froze the blood in their veins. The final footage was brief, just a few shaky minutes. Thomas walking along the bridge at night, his face pale, eyes hollow. He paused, staring into the darkness, and behind him, emerging from the black water, was Elizabeth Harrow, her hair plastered to her face, gown torn and sodden, her eyes cold and lifeless, her lips curling into that dreadful, knowing smile. Thomas looked directly into the lens. His lips moved, but no sound came. Then, in the faintest whisper, the voice of Elizabeth filled the room through the camera's speaker. Another groom, forever mine. No one dared touch the river after that. The streets emptied at dusk, the bridges abandoned, and those who passed by Pulteney Bridge swore they heard a faint sobbing in the mist, the whisper of silk across stone, and a voice that would never forgive, never release. Elizabeth Harrow remained eternal, her curse unbroken, her bridegroom ever waiting beneath the dark waters of the River Avon. The legend had claimed another soul, and the river whispered on.
Thank you for following.